to represent. But that's who I am and where I stand today. Standing strong. You gotta let you butt me or push me away.
This is the Razor Sharp program, and this is a review of Razor Sharp. My name is Sharon Firebrace, and I've got with me Colin Long, and he's the Secretary of the NTEU, which is the National Tertiary Education Union. Welcome on board, Colin.
Thanks, Sharon.
Yes, Colin, it's been a big week. We've had Parliament return back to, of course, Parliament itself, all the politicians, and yet we've got now looming before us a federal election. This is what the big concern has been. We've got the Turnball government now, which is really the Abbott-Turnball, still the Abbott policies in place. Mr Abbott, of course, was ousted. Extreme right-wing policies was being proposed by him, ended up very low in the polls. Mr Turnbull's much more popular. We're looking at something like 53-47 in the polls. They're certainly ahead, the Liberal National Conservative Party. But they may very well, and I suppose the big concern is, will they remain ahead in the polls? Do you think the public are satisfied enough, the fact that they've given them so little material, they've been operating in secrecy, they haven't brought forth the budget that they promised, the budget framework before the Christmas break, and also too, there's a lot more data at the moment that they haven't laid on the table in terms of policies. Will they be able to stay ahead in the polls, do you think, or do you think that they're going to lose and that they lose traction and that the ALP may very well gain traction?
I think it will tighten. To the extent it does will depend on a number of factors, I think. I mean, Turnbull is experiencing a honeymoon that we'd all love to have experienced. Those of us who got married would have loved to have had a honeymoon like that that's gone on for 6 or 7 months. And that is, I think that's almost entirely because people were so relieved to get rid of Tony Abbott. I mean, Tony Abbott had become a major liability, an embarrassment, a laughing stock. And I think people were so relieved to get rid of him that they've been prepared to give Turnbull a huge amount of leeway. The problem is, as you've hinted at, the policies for the Liberals haven't changed. The government's policies haven't changed. And it would appear that Turnbull is finding it very difficult to change those policies because fundamentally the Liberal Party is a very right-wing beast these days. And Turnbull is kind of lipstick on a pig. And that's still a pig. You know, you put lipstick on it, but it's still a pig. So I think he doesn't have huge factional strength within the Liberal Party. I think the Liberal Party is fundamentally a very right-wing organisation. Turnbull would probably consider himself centre-right. Abbott was clearly a far-right politician in many ways, and much of the Liberal Party is. So he's finding it very difficult to bring the Liberal Party along with him. And some of the rest of this, how the Liberals perform in the election year will, I think, depend on the extent to which Turnbull is able to stare down the far right within the Liberal Party, but also whether Bill Shorten is able to improve his performance, because he's been very lacklustre. I don't think there's a lot of confidence in Bill Shorten from the left or the centre left in Australia, but I presume he's here to stay for the duration of the electoral contest. But there are also a few issues, you know, the increase to the GST, tax on penalty rates. Those sorts of issues could play very badly for the government. And if they do go to a budget, if they don't go to an election before the budget and they bring down another budget similar to the one that Joe Hockey brought down last year, then that's a real risk for them too, because that was very unsuccessful for the Liberals, as we know.
Yes, and with that budget that was brought down, I mean, that was knocked together by the National Commission of Audit. That's the 2014 budget that Mr Abbott brought in. So really what we're seeing here is that this partnership between government, whether it be the Labor or the Liberal Party, with the corporations is really sinking the country, sinking the nation. It seems like we're running with policies that are being sculpted out and chipped out by corporations. And that's sort of, I think, entrenched in our tax, the proposed tax structure and the tax changes. So We've still got a large element of the Tony Abbott 2014 budget before us. So, there's been talk and argy-bargy, but there's been no commitment. And that maybe is the problem with the Turnbull government. There's been a lot of talk, but there's been very little that's been committed to. And that's what the big concern, is it not? I mean, it is lipstick on the pig.
Yes.
No matter how we look at this, still behind Mr Turnbull is a very conservative, very right-wing party that seems to be controlling the government and also to the corporations with them. And they certainly have objectives, and that is, greater profit. And, of course, it is the beast of the Liberal Party in operation here. But the big question is, will they have an election before the budget's handed down? This budget seems to be the very ticklish issue that got made the Liberal Party and Mr Abbott himself remove because of the popularity of it, and it was all sculpted out by the corporations, by the National Commission of Audit with Tony Shepherd. So we're seeing that it's a bad partnership. It seems like they're using the politicians in the Parliament to push the policies for the corporations here. How do you see that?
That was a very standard play from the neoliberal playbook, and it's happened in many countries in the world. It's happened in Australia before, and in some of the states, where government will appoint a so-called independent commission of audit. They handpick the people, so it was Tony Shepherd from the Business Council, and that commission of audit comes down with recommendations which are extreme, largely, and then the government will say, we'll introduce somewhat less extreme policies, and saying, well, we took some advice from the Commission of Audit, but we wouldn't do all that, so we're being reasonable. So it's take the boundary out as far as you possibly can to the right by the Commission of Audit, and then you introduce policies which are slightly less to the right, and you pretend that you're being very reasonable and centrist. It's fairly standard play from the neoliberal playbook. It didn't work very well with the national budget, largely because Joe Hockey was so incompetent and so ruthless, and his budget was so brutal and so clearly targeted at the poor rather than the well-off. So the problem is for the Liberals now, I think, is that they want a budget. A budget will not provide... Their biggest problem, I suppose, is that if they don't go to the budget, if they don't have a budget this year, then if they don't want to have a budget this year, they will have to have a double dissolution election. Now, there's risks in that, and I can come back to that. Their biggest problem with going to a budget is there's not an awful lot of money in the coffers, so they can't go out pork barrelling extensively in the lead up to the election. And there's a reasonable chance that the Australian economy is going to perform very poorly for the rest of this year. And in fact, the budgetary situation will deteriorate in the next few months and over the course of the year. And they will be unable to bring down a budget with many sweeteners in it. And then how do you go to an election pretty soon after that budget with another very nasty... how do you go to an election straight after the budget with a very nasty budget to play with? But the other alternative for them is to go to the double dissolution election before the budget, and the risks in that are that they could get a more hostile Senate than the one they have now, and they have a Senate that they've struggled to get legislation through, and because of the nature of a double dissolution election where all senators are up for election and the quota is smaller for a senator to get elected, there's a reasonable chance that there would be more minor party or Greens saying elected to the Senate, and they don't want that. So my prediction is they will go to full term and they won't have a double dissolution election, but you never know. They are preparing the triggers for a double dissolution election mainly around union governance issues.
Yes.
So they may try to run on that. I'm not sure that that has enough impact in the electorate to run a double dissolution election on.
Yeah, well, we noticed that Howard himself, if we just sort of backtrack a bit, John Howard himself used the issue of the Northern Territory intervention, the very racist sort of rev up on Black Australia to kind of, pallet the public in his way, ready for the election. And it seems like, what this government is doing now, which is, it was just Tony Abbott after Mr Howard, Liberal-wise, Conservative-wise, and then, now we're seeing Malcolm Turnball. So, we're seeing here that now there's a kind of the cocktail being mixed up here is the one against the union. So the anti-union flavour, the black flavour we used under Howard, here it's the anti-union, with the view to attempt to kind of drag and pull the public his way in the polls. Now, therefore, we would argue that that's very unjust, very unfair, and that it was seen to be like a witch hunt conducted by this Liberal government. An abuse of power, we would argue, an abuse of taxpayer funds, given the fact they put $700 million into the Royal Commission investigation into union organisations. So we can see some very strong parallels here, Colin. So in which case, it's almost predictable they're seeing the pull on that, but it may very well wear out very soon. Are people, is the public thinking the bigger issue is really the budget? The bigger issue is the cost of living, the fact that we've got 2.5 million people now that are in poverty, the fact that 600,000 children are living in poverty, which is very historical, the fact that people are concerned about their jobs and work and conditions, pay on Sunday, attempting to be eroded by this government. Will that carry greater traction for the public out there at large, or are they really on about union bashing, but are not the people in the public on about they're familiar with the unions in the workplace, the good that the unions have done, the fact that the unions have been there to fight at the battle line against corporations and big bosses, so that people get good take-home pay. And the big concern has been the loss of wages and versus the cost of living, which is obviously paying back in people's pockets. And then on the other side of this equation is from the sale and privatisation of public assets like our gas, electricity, water, telephone. All of our utilities have become so costly, and they've risen in price, and that's created the cost of living to skyrocket. And of course, with that is a pain, an economic pain that the people have suffered. So will the people wake up and think, we've got to terminate all those contracts, we've got to get rid of privatisation, we need to change a government, we need to move in a different direction? Will they assert their authority that they have as being the primary piece of furniture within the constitution of this country, that is we the people? So, do you think we're at that stage of turnabout in the nation? Will they lift the lid on the Abbott Turnbull government here and begin to ask the hardline questions that are necessary?
I don't know. Well, I don't think the Australian Constitution starts with we the people. I think that the Australian Constitution is basically a free trade agreement between states, so I don't expect too much out of the Australian Constitution. Let's be clear about, in relation to unions, the Liberal Party has been wanting to destroy unions since, well, at least for the last 30 years, probably forever, but at least for the last 30 years, it has been wanting to destroy unions so that it can prevent unions representing workers' rights and therefore allow business free control over the labour market and be able to drive down what terms and conditions of employers. That's what the Liberal Party fundamentally stands for. They tried it with work choices and were unsuccessful. But we must be very clear that both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party have introduced legislation and changes that have fundamentally weakened the union movement. The Labor Party probably equally as much as the coalition. So the union movement has been almost fatally weakened over the last 30 years by reducing its ability to take industrial action, weakening its ability to represent workers, and so on. The Royal Commission was an obvious attempt to destroy unions. It has found some instances of corruption, but most of those were already known and they should be condemned unequivocally. The corruption within the HSU, it would appear there's some corruption in the New South Wales branch of the NUW, things like that. Now, they should be treated with the utmost force of the law. They could have been done, most of that could have been done outside a Royal Commission. But the whole lot of stuff in the Royal Commission, the recommendations that are being put out from the Royal Commission, are not about tackling corruption as such. They're about constraining the independence of trade unions and reducing the ability of trade unions to represent their members.
Etc. So there's a distortion and perversion, really, of the truth here by this Royal Commission.
That's right.
And by Dyson Heydon, who's head.
Certainly there were allegations that he was inappropriately far too close to the Liberal Party. He agreed to attend a fundraiser during the term of the Commission, and that, to me, and many other people, seemed unreasonable. He ruled against, saying that he wasn't biased. People can take their own
opinion on it.
Opinion on that, but I don't think anyone would say he's necessarily corrupt. But
just on that point there, I mean, if you're appointed as the judge to preside over a Royal Commission, you are to be independent. Now, but it was proven that he was not independent in this case. So
it hasn't been proven.
Well, there was that he
certainly
had attended all those Liberal Party fundraising activities. So not just on one case, but on multiple. So that therefore the independence of that, the independence therefore would require a person to actually resign themselves and to step down. He never stepped down, and on top of it too, that he really should have investigated jurisdictional issues raised by a man by the name of Gerrit Sherrill-Halavka, who's a constitutionalist and has been involved in many cases. But Dyson Heydon refused to actually acknowledge it and to investigate the powers of jurisdiction that he had, Dyson Heydon, to preside in this case in a Royal Commission of this type. So it's very important that he should have done that, and he failed to do that. And therefore in other similar cases they've been struck out and not been able to proceed until the jurisdictional powers have been addressed. So that's a huge matter that's presiding over this Royal Commission, and therefore almost strike out the Royal Commission and call it null and void, and that it should be disassembled.
Well, the issue, I mean, I don't know any of the detail of that, but the problem with that is the Commission has concluded. It's provided its report. The government is using the report. It's been a very political process all along, and I don't think issues about constitutionality or any of that are all that important in a sense, because the clear thing, it's been a very political process. It's obvious because the government won't even provide the unredacted report to the Labor Party or the Greens, and it's trying to introduce legislation based on the report, but won't even provide it to the Labor Party or the Greens.
Well, there we are, and that's another reason which you would say is a corrupt process. It's a perverted process, whatever the word is. It's a wrong process because, all parties involved, you must know the case against you.
It's a political process.
And you're innocent until proven guilty. And so, to bring in, you must know the documentation, you must know the case against you in order to respond. And if the government is asking for, the Greens and crossbenchers and members of the ALP and so forth to make a judgment and a decision, they cannot without the full documentation. So that should be provided. There's elements of secrecy here, which is unhealthy. It smells and reeks of a Star Chamber trial, and the unions are being subjected to Star Chamber trial activity and declared guilty without an overturn of the principle of the law of the land, which is you're innocent until proven guilty. So this has been imposed down upon the union movement. That is wrong, unlawful, and unjust. And on top of it, now to impose the ABCC on top of it, which is an instrumentality that is again steeped in secrecy, brought in by John Howard, and as well, not just secrecy, but doesn't give a person a right to respond, subjects people to that which is seen to be, Star Chamber activity, rather than free, open transparency of law for people within the union movement. So this is a mass change, is it not, of, it's almost a velvet revolution, law-wise, economy-wise, and we're seeing in terms of legal investigation of a Royal Commission, which should be no mud splattered beforehand, should be totally left silent. It's splashed across all the papers because the people involved are innocent till proven guilty. And if there's any guilt that Mr Hayden is suggesting, then that's got to go to the appropriate authorities for them to investigate. There should be nothing mentioned about it, nothing in the press, until there has been a properly conducted investigation according to right law process. So, and that has not been the case. So it's been a mass attack against the unions. But this may very well splash back into the face of Mr Turnball. Do you not think it may very well be the very issue that he's gone too far on?
No, I suspect not. I'm a little bit surprised at the way they've handled the Royal Commission report. They don't seem to have used it as much as we might have expected as yet, but maybe they have plans to do so. I don't see. I mean, they've played it fairly well, as you said. The Royal Commission itself and Dyson Hayden, they fed stories to the media during the Commission proceedings. They leaked material. They made allegations. They made some allegations which were then proven to be wrong. But once you've thrown a bit of mud, it tends to stick. So they've done all of that. It was a thoroughly political process. But you know, that is in the nature in some ways of, well, certainly in the way that the Liberal Party has used Royal Commissions. I mean, you have to understand that in every term of government for the last 40 years or something, the Liberals have had a Royal Commission of Trade Unions in some way. They do it every time. It's not a new process.
But it's a bit like Aboriginal services and programs. I mean, it comes under scrutiny, attack, the reduction of funding and finances. But again, too, it kind of revs up the public prior to an election and wins favour of the public, hopefully supporting that political party. John Howard, Mr Abbott, and also now we're seeing now with the Turnball government. So it comes as no surprises. But as you said, it's all lipstick on a pig because, I mean, the thing is that, you know...
The Liberals need enemies, and they're always very good at creating enemies. If you go back to the Howard years, Howard was in a lot of trouble in his first term of government. Now, people put a lot of the turnaround to... well, later on, he managed to pull the hat out of the fire a few times by targeting refugees and so on. But in the early days, people forget now that Howard played the race card pretty strongly. He played the fear of Aboriginal
take over the lands.
Exactly.
Yeah, on land rights and treaty and
10-point plan for the extinguishment of native title and all of that.
Precisely.
They played that card pretty strongly. Liberals, they don't. The essence of the Liberal vision for our society is that people should go out and act selfishly, earn as much money as they can so they can buy as big a TV as they can. But that's basically it. It doesn't mean much though. There's not a greater sense of asking for people to belong to something bigger than themselves or to contribute to a broader society, because they don't effectively really believe in a society. They believe in individuals. So when you've got that sort of vision, you do need to have some means of bringing people along and believing in something somewhat bigger. And often it's been, for the Liberals, it's a very negative thing. So they say, we belong to something, to a community, and the best way to define that is to define the people who are outside our group. And in the initial stages of the Howard government, it's the Aboriginal people. They're out there, well, they're our enemy. Later it became refugees. Unions, it's always been there. And for a while, especially in the Howard years, they tried to develop a more positive sense of belonging to something, and that's when they really got onto the whole Anzac myth and pushed the militarisation of Australian society and celebration of the military history of Australia. That was an attempt to try and give people something to believe in, because it's hard to believe in how big a TV can I get? It's nothing to believe in, is it? So,
yeah, but they've turned the military hand now to, particularly on Australia Day, a lot more, which is Invasion Day, as Aboriginal Australia knows and practices, and the border protection as well, and also to an increase in policing in each of the states. I mean, this has been of great concern. Even a military person as well received Australian of the Year award. I mean, so we are developing more of a military type and style of look to this government and patriotism that they seem to be developing. And that's of concern too, because I mean, it seems to be moving out of democracy into something that's a little bit more strong arm, strong man, dictatorship style. When you start to see more military invasion on Aboriginal lands under John Howard, military tanks brought in for the Northern Territory intervention laws, the abolition of ATSIC, the bringing in and removing the basics card and now a health card that now is going to span and impact and affect all Australians. So. We are seeing these moves. So it's part of this new redress on this new image and this new direction. But, we still haven't had a referendum on the major issues. We still haven't had a budget that contains policies which really is a fix-the-budget type budget. And the budget still remains attacking individuals. And we really should be looking at the corrupt CEOs of major corporations, the 800 or 900 major corporations that aren't paying tax. We should be looking at investigations into the 4 major banks in terms of their profits and so forth and their conduct, as well as the fact that the taking and stealing, some would state, of with financial advisors that work for the banks. I mean, why aren't there investigations into these? And also to the conduct of politicians. I mean, why don't we have, politicians, certainly in terms of their retirements, the fact that they've got the gold card, they have numerous trips. We've had, the splashing of cash, so to speak, lavish type lifestyle, investments in multiple properties. They control the agenda in terms of, housing and investments in the nation. Is it vested interest, pecuniary interest and conflict of interest that we're dealing with, and not public interest and people interest? And as you said, I mean, there's a conflict here with the Liberals, and we're out to strive for individualism, and hence there's $1.1 billion there for innovation. And if they're really going to be innovative, should they not be putting that $1.1 billion into the pockets of small business? But we've seen the small business under the time of Abbott and Mr Turnball ransacked. We've seen 9.5% of businesses close and crash. It's been upgraded about 10% from 2004 to 2015. We can expect more fallout now, and we see joblessness rising. 6.5% before Christmas, around about November, to now within these few months, it's now at 5.9%. So I mean, how can you have such a huge drop of joblessness, or that they've created more jobs when we're still seeing 25% of youth unemployed? So the rubber's hitting the road. We do need to have, and this might be our last point, but the unions have played a very active role. They've got a very important role in our economy. They've certainly been there to bat for jobs and for wages. They've been there certainly on our superannuation, where the industry super has certainly brought us better results in our superannuation, the best results. Yet they want to axe the unions, like they wanted to ATSIC, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Commission, because it was so effective, so efficient, really putting points on the scoreboard for Indigenous Australia. We're seeing now that the unions too, being very effective and efficient in superannuation industry, best results now under the pump, under the scrutiny. But where is all this going to lead us? What's ahead of us in terms of the fight?
Well, I mean, I think there's obviously we face a federal election, and the problem is elections are really probably not where we have to make the fundamental changes. Obviously, we want to get rid of the Liberals at any opportunity in any election. That is important, but we also do need a renewal on the left, a renewal of union leadership, a renewal of thinking and ideas on the left, a coalescence of organisations, movements, community organisations, environmental organisations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations with unions, and we need to come together a lot more to, as has happened a little bit in recent years. The Bust the Budget rallies, which were very effective and did bring together big coalitions of organisations. Some of that work is being done in the climate change field where you've got Aboriginal traditional owners of the land that is threatened by mining coming together with environmental organisations and being supported by unions. So it's really about building a clear sense of and making an argument. I think it needs to come from the grassroots and from unions and pushed up to the Labor Party. We can't expect the Labor Party anymore, I don't think, to develop a truly progressive vision for Australia, which we can all support the Labor Party in doing, because they're not going to do it. I think the grassroots of society, all of these organisations, need to develop a truly progressive vision for Australia, and then maybe one day the Labor Party might start to advocate for that. The Greens have a reasonably progressive vision for society, but they don't get the same sort of attention from the media, and they don't get the same opportunities, let's face it, during election years. So that's what I think. It needs to actually be a slow, hard-working process of building a progressive vision for Australia, and for organisations like unions going out and knocking on doors and talking to people about it. And unions are doing that now. The Victorian Trades Hall Council has been transformed into a terrific campaigning organisation and is doing this sort of work, going out and talking to people. Environmental organisations now, rather than trying to lobby politicians, are going out there and talking to people in their houses and on the street about their issues and their policies, and that's what we need to do. We need to change hearts and minds on the ground with a view to a long-term strategy of advocating for a decent, just and fair society, and pointing out that the Liberals do not have such a vision.
Yes, indeed, and perhaps acting like we did, and we saw just on the long weekend just gone, and that was when all the public walked out of the job, did not want to return on the Monday because they took the Monday as a long weekend. So when the people decide that it's time to walk out, or it's time that it's we're taking time, and when they are the decision makers, well then that cannot be stopped. You cannot stop the tide of that. And that, I think, it illustrates and demonstrates the power at play here of the masses of the 99% versus the 1% which are controlling us. So that's a big issue, and perhaps a point that we might want to take with us, listeners. So something to think about too is that and put this in our diaries, that on the 20th of February, which is this Saturday, don't forget that there's a big rally at the State Library, and that's about the cuts. The cuts are killing us, it's called. You can get that online, and it's about the cuts to Medicare, the cuts to, we're seeing it's going to be cuts to superannuation. It will be cuts, across the board, particularly in the welfare arena, as this government considers that, that revenue will be raised through cutbacks to the public at large. So we're not to forget that. So take that in mind, listeners, and let's be challenged that we need to be a people that will be active in being united. In that sense, we will never be defeated. That's been an issue of the union movement, to unite the people and unite the public. And we need to, of course, work with our unions and work together to see that they've been there in the bargaining place to ensure that we get a good pay, we get a good condition, and that's the very thing that keeps the big bosses respectful of the workers, and also too on the back foot. So we're not to forget that. And I want to thank you very much indeed, Colin Long, who's the Secretary of the NTEU, for joining me today, laying the issues before us, and also to giving some clarity and some light on particularly the economic and political situation before us as all common Australians. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. This is Sharon Firebrace saying goodbye.
Fire like a pistol, you're not with my brothers and sisters. Can you feel the question and the message represent?